This story concerns an old house, a book of some antiquity, and the consequences of bringing one too readily into the other. It is not for me to say how much of what follows admits of a rational explanation. I can only present the account as it stands, and leave you to form your own conclusions. The Calswell Witch, written and read by Christopher Halton. During the early 1930s, I was fortunate enough to acquire Latham House, situated in the heart of the historic town of Calswell, Essex. It suited admirably my purposes as a dealer in antiques and objets d'art. The rather spacious ground floor front room answered perfectly as a showroom. The house, though faced in 18th century red brick, was in fact timber framed and of considerably earlier origin, dating, so I was informed, from the 14th century, an inheritance which, I was later to reflect, had not altogether relinquished its hold upon the place. The doorway, a handsome affair surmounted by an arched pediment above a demi-lune fanlight and fitted with a black-panelled door, had about it that air of proportion and quiet dignity which speaks of former prosperity and settled taste. My speciality was furniture and porcelain, though I occasionally acquired objects outside those branches where they possessed sufficient interest to tempt a discerning buyer of means. It was, perhaps, in this latter habit that I first went astray. The ground floor was chiefly given over to display, while my wife and I occupied the rooms above. I had been a collector and dealer of some standing for many years, and Latham House seemed to me then to mark the summit of my professional life. My wife Jennifer, the daughter of a retired clergyman of comfortable means, had long assisted with the financial side of the business, and it would not be an exaggeration to say that whatever success I enjoyed had been made the easier by her constancy and good sense. But in this I digress. We had been trading for some 8 months when, on a wet and cheerless Wednesday in April of 1932, I received a visit from Charles Clarendon, son of the late William Clarendon, a collector of books and manuscripts who had formerly occupied a small cottage on the outskirts of the town. Charles, a man perhaps in his late 40s, had an unshaven and neglected appearance, smelt strongly of drink, and possessed a manner which both Jennifer and I had always found faintly disagreeable. There was about him, moreover, that air of careless dissipation which suggests a man who has outlived both his means and his judgment. He carried beneath his arm a bulky rectangular object wrapped in cloth, which he set down, somewhat hastily, upon the table where I conducted the daily business of the shop. Fixing me with an odd brightness of eye, he began to unwrap it, and disclosed an ancient leather-bound volume, worn about the cover but otherwise sound, bearing the title, A True and Particular Account of Sundry Witches, lately examined in the county of Essex, with observations thereupon, and dated 1646. I turned over a few leaves, and my eye was caught by a passage concerning Anne Carter, but what truly gave me pause was a small handwritten note on the reverse of the title page, in an ink faded almost to sepia. This being my true testimony, bound with a lock of her own hair and sealed with her blood, that the work may never lie quiet. The signature beneath was a shaky A. Carter. I took it for some previous owner's fanciful inscription, and thought no more of it at the time. I concluded that the book might very well attract a local collector, and having agreed upon a cash payment, we parted company. Clarendon, I gathered, making for one of the town's hostelries. Jennifer took up the book after he had gone, and with a faint smile said, "This looks most interesting, my dear. May I keep it by me for a few weeks for my own reading?" She had always been fond of old books, and the subject had evidently engaged her at once. A few days later, I began to observe in her a certain coldness of manner such as I had not seen before. Ordinarily of a cheerful and even temper, she now seemed at times abstracted, and showed an impatience with our maid Alicia, which was quite foreign to her. On one occasion she spoke sharply to the girl for dropping a cleaning brush and called her a fool. I remonstrated with her afterwards, and for a moment she appeared to recover herself, offering an explanation which, though unsatisfactory, I did not press. At night she would sit up late, absorbed in the volume. I said once, "What is there, my dear, that so engages you at such hours?" She looked up, removed her spectacles, and replied in a curious tone, "It is truth I seek, not Hopkins's lies." Beyond that she would say nothing, but returned at once to her reading with an attention that had already begun to seem excessive, so much so that on one occasion I thought I heard her speaking softly aloud, as though repeating words not entirely her own. There were besides one or two small incidents not easily dismissed. On one occasion I was almost certain that I heard from the adjoining room the sound of a woman sobbing. Yet when I entered I found nothing there to account for it. My uneasiness increased sufficiently that one afternoon, under the colour of calling upon a client in Felsted, I turned aside to visit Jennifer's father, who lived there in retirement with his wife in a substantial turn-of-the-century house. I found him in his study, a comfortable room lined with books, and after some general enquiry, I ventured with as much care as I could to describe the alteration I had observed in Jennifer's manner. He heard me without interruption, though with a faint smile I could not wholly interpret. "My dear fellow," he said at length, "you must not let yourself be unduly troubled. Jennifer has always had a reflective disposition, and from time to time she becomes deeply engaged in whatever subject interests her. It is a habit that soon passes." Though his tone was reassuring, I left with the impression that he had not attached to my account the seriousness I had intended. I therefore asked what he knew of the rather wordily titled volume that had so occupied his daughter. He replied, "I have heard of it, though until now I had half doubted whether it existed at all, for no one within my memory has claimed to have read it. I am told that the author's name is a false one, and that Malachi Jacob is the pseudonym most commonly associated with it, though I cannot say who the man was." I thanked him for his advice and returned home. Jennifer was in the kitchen preparing a rabbit stew. The smell of it was excellent, and I remarked upon my good fortune, for it was not her custom to prepare such things, she having for many years adhered to a vegetarian diet. She turned and looked at me with a puzzled expression. "What nonsense, my dear," she said. "This is for us both." After 15 years of marriage, I could not be mistaken in such a matter, and yet she spoke with a confidence which admitted no uncertainty on her part. The change was so marked, and her denial of it so complete, that I found myself at a loss. Nor was this the only alteration. Where once her hair had been carefully dressed, she now wore it drawn plainly back into a bun, and her clothing, too, had acquired a plainness more suited to an earlier age. Her gowns were fastened high at the neck and close at the wrists, made of a heavier and duller material than any she had formerly favoured, and secured not by buttons, but by a series of small hooks and eyes, so neatly set as to be scarcely visible. The cut of them recalled certain plates I had seen in old volumes, fashions long out of use, and certainly not of the present century. Alicia, our maid, became increasingly uneasy about what she perceived in Jennifer's altered manner, and after some months gave notice and left us. By that time Jennifer, or Jenny, as she now preferred to be called, had readily taken to performing such household tasks herself, so that there was no immediate need to engage another servant. These changes were gradual and insidious, affecting not merely her habits but her whole bearing and way of speaking. Indeed, it was only afterwards that I understood the alteration had been at work long before I had allowed myself to recognize it, the earlier signs having been so slight as to pass almost without notice. Another peculiarity soon established itself in her habits. At certain hours of the day she would withdraw to the attic, remaining there sometimes for the better part of an hour before descending again without remark and resuming her occupations below. I questioned her more than once as to the purpose of these visits, but she replied with an impatience unusual in her that she preferred the quiet of that place and would sit there by candlelight to read the book undisturbed. On one such occasion, as she passed me upon the stairs, I observed that her hands were faintly blackened, as though with soot, and that there clung about her clothes a curious odour, not of smoke precisely, but of something damp and earthen, as of soil long enclosed. When I remarked upon it, she made no answer, but moved past me with a look I did not care to interpret. And so matters proceeded, slowly yet with an air of quiet assurance. Even her speech had altered, taking on a rustic inflection very unlike that of the well-spoken woman I had married. Within a few months I could not but admit, though reluctantly, that the change in her was no passing phase. She no longer concerned herself with the daily management of the shop, but would instead go out alone carrying a small basket and return with it filled with herbs I could not readily identify. When at last I spoke plainly of my uneasiness, she laughed outright, an expression so foreign to her former manner that it gave me pause, and said, "You may say what you please. It is not I who am in error. Fear will have its answer soon enough." I could not rid myself of the impression that there was something in the attic which she was at pains to conceal from me. Accordingly, on an afternoon when she had gone out with her basket, I resolved, though not without hesitation, to examine the place for myself. I knew where the key was kept, a large, old-fashioned iron thing hanging upon a hook fixed to a beam near the door. The lock, long unused, resisted at first, but yielded at length with a dull reluctance, and the heavy oak door swung inward with a low and not altogether agreeable sound. With the aid of an electric torch, I cast the beam about the interior. The space appeared ancient and long neglected, rafters thick with dust and cobwebs, the air close and faintly sour. Yet it was clear the room had seen recent activity. Footprints disturbed the dust on the floorboards, and upon an old pine table fresh herbs lay drying beside older brittle bunches. The mortar and pestle contained the coarse powder of recently crushed berries. Along one wall, a narrow shelf held apothecary jars, some coated in heavy dust, others cleaner, their contents evidently replenished. Most disturbing of all was a narrow and ancient door set into the side of the great brick chimney stack. The same key opened it. Beyond lay a hidden chamber of some size, heavy with the atmosphere of the 17th century. Suspended from the beams were a number of small figures fashioned from plaited straw, rude in form, yet unmistakably intended to represent the human shape. To each there was affixed a scrap of cloth, as though cut from a garment, and a narrow slip of paper upon which was written, in a neat copperplate hand, a surname. Some of the figures looked old and brittle, others appeared newly made. I took careful note of the names attached to them, and resolved at the first opportunity to make some inquiry as to their meaning. My wife, if I may still so call her, had by this time altered so markedly in her manner that the change did not pass unremarked by others. On more than one occasion, neighbours, encountering her in the street, spoke afterwards of her with evident unease, remarking upon the plainness of her dress, the curious fashion in which it was worn, and the singular turn her speech had taken. So much so that one was moved to think of an earlier age rather than the present day. These reports, slight in themselves, served only to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. It was not, however, until I turned my attention to the history of the house that certain particulars, hitherto isolated and without clear relation, began reluctantly to assume a more coherent aspect. In the course of my inquiries, I was led to examine certain parish records and other local accounts relating to the history of Latham House, and from these I learned that during the disturbances of the mid-17th century, the building had been used for a time as a place of examination in matters connected with the detection of witchcraft. Several women of the neighbourhood were there brought under suspicion, and following proceedings of a most questionable character, were induced, by means I need not particularise, to make admissions which were afterwards taken as proof of their guilt. Of these, 4 were ultimately condemned and hanged. What most arrested my attention, however, was the recurrence in these records of certain surnames, names borne by those who had taken part in the examinations, and which I could not fail to recognise as identical with those attached to the figures I had observed in the attic. Further inquiries, pursued with some reluctance, served to strengthen an impression which I would willingly have dismissed. The surnames in question were not merely historical, but still to be found among families resident in the district, and of the 6 names I had noted, no fewer than 4 corresponded to persons lately deceased, some within quite recent memory, while the remaining 2 were still borne by families in the district. The circumstances of these deaths, though outwardly unremarkable, being attributed in each case to illness or misadventure, struck me, in the light of what I had seen, as not entirely free from a certain disquieting correspondence. I began, under these circumstances, to question the reliability of my own impressions. Yet, do what I might, I could not wholly rid myself of the notion that this change in Jennifer was connected, in some obscure way, with that volume which had so completely engrossed her. There was, too, the attic room, its situation, its evident antiquity, and a further consideration which I scarcely cared to entertain, that this house itself might once have borne some relation, however indirect, to the proceedings so minutely recorded in those pages. The thought, once admitted, was not easily dismissed. My thoughts returned more than once to a passage I had observed in that volume, concerning one Anne Carter, and a certain mark said to have been found upon her arm. It then occurred to me that of late Jennifer had been careful, whether in her daily dress or even in her night attire, to keep her arms entirely covered. The circumstance, slight in itself, assumed in my mind a degree of significance which I could not readily dismiss. I therefore determined, if occasion should present itself, to satisfy myself upon that point. There was, I thought, a growing distance between us which no ordinary means could bridge, and I was troubled by the sense that if I delayed much longer I might find her altogether beyond my reach. An opportunity presented itself a few days later. She had gone to bathe, and whether through carelessness or some other cause, had failed to secure the door. I approached without intention, and finding it yield slightly beneath my hand, entered before I had fully considered the impropriety of doing so. She stood with her back partly turned, and it was then that I observed upon the upper part of her left arm a small and singular excrescence, of a kind I could not recall having seen upon her person before. It was of a darker hue than the surrounding skin, and possessed a form at once irregular and yet curiously defined. At that instant she became aware of my presence, and with a cry that was less of surprise than of anger, turned upon me, hastily concealing the spot with her hand. There was in her expression a violence wholly foreign to her former manner, which caused me to withdraw at once. From that moment I could no longer dismiss what I had seen as some trivial or natural blemish. The account of Anne Carter recurred to me with increasing insistence, until I found myself contemplating a possibility which I scarcely dared to frame, and yet could not wholly reject. I knew I could not resolve this matter by sheer confrontation, and waited for an opportunity to enter the attic room while she was away from the property. After some searching, I discovered the volume concealed within an old Bible box. Without pausing to consider the act, I carried it below and cast it upon the fire, tearing out such pages as I could and thrusting them after it. When at last I examined the volume more closely before burning it, I noticed something I had missed before. Several of the woodcut illustrations, particularly the one depicting Anne Carter at her examination, showed a curious flaw. The figure's eyes had been pricked through with a needle, and tiny fragments of what looked like human hair were glued behind the paper. The book was not merely old, it had been made into something far worse. It was at that moment that I became aware, whether in truth or through some fearful deception of the senses, I cannot say, of a figure standing near the hearth. It bore in all particulars the appearance of the woman described in the book, Anne Carter herself, as though she had stepped forth from its pages. She made as if to seize the burning leaves, and turning upon me with an expression of terrible purpose, cried, "Thou hast meddled where thou shouldst not. The mark is set, and thy name shall follow. As I was judged, so shalt thou be." At that instant Jennifer came unsteadily into the room. She appeared bewildered, as though newly roused from a long sleep, and passed a hand across her eyes. Then she saw the figure by the hearth, and stopped. A look of recognition, cold and dreadful, crossed her face. "It was you," she whispered in a voice scarcely her own. "You who twisted their words. You who set the innocent against one another until the rope took them. Anne Carter, the real witch. You should have hanged. You were meant for the rope, and yet you stand." As I thrust the last pages into the fire, the figure gave a cry, shrill and prolonged, and seemed to diminish and recede, as though drawn backwards into some depth I could neither see nor comprehend. For an instant the air grew cold and carried the same damp earthen smell I had noticed on my wife's clothes after her visits to the attic. Then the flames consumed the final leaves, and the apparition was gone. Jennifer swayed violently. I caught her as she fell. When she recovered a few moments later, she was once more herself, quiet, sensible, and faintly alarmed by the smell of burnt paper and the open Bible box upon the table. Of all that had passed in recent months, she remembered nothing. In the weeks that followed, I made further inquiries into the town's history. The records appeared to confirm what the apparition's words had suggested, that Anne Carter, herself accused, had turned suspicion upon others, with the result that several innocent persons were brought to their deaths. The straw figures I had found in the attic bore the surnames of those who had suffered, and of their descendants. 4 of those same families had, within recent years, experienced losses under circumstances not wholly free from unease. We disposed of Latham House soon afterwards, and removed to a plain Victorian shop with rooms above, where we resumed our business. The dormer window is now concealed behind a rebuilt roofline, and no light has shone there these past 4 years. Yet I cannot say we left the shadow of the place entirely behind us. Jennifer is once more the sensible, affectionate woman I married, and she has never asked for the book nor spoken of those months. But there are evenings, especially when the weather is damp and the wind moves in the chimney, when I catch her standing quite still, her head a little to one side as though listening. If I speak to her then, she starts, and for the briefest instant her eyes carry a look that is not hers. It passes almost at once, and she smiles at me with her old gentleness. Still, I have noticed that she now keeps her left arm covered, even in the warmest weather, and once, when she thought herself alone, I heard her murmur softly, "Not yet." I have burned every note and scrap of paper that might remind us of Calswell. I have told myself the matter is finished, and yet on certain damp evenings, when the smell of turned earth drifts through the rooms with no cause I can discover, I find myself wondering whether the lock of hair and the drop of blood were not merely part of the binding, but the binding itself, whether Anne Carter's true testimony was ever truly meant to be read by the living at all. Of one thing I am certain: some books should not be opened, and some houses should not be bought, no matter how handsome the doorway or how quiet the street. We do not speak of Anne Carter, but I know she has not forgotten the names. The end.